Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this important hearing on the disappearing corporate income tax. Mr. Holtz-Eakin, do tax cuts pay for themselves?
No.
Thank you. Tax legislation should be enacted, I believe, in a bipartisan and fiscally responsible manner, with careful consideration given to the law's effect on the nation as a whole. The Republicans' tax cut didn't come remotely close to paying for themselves by turbocharging the economy, as the president repeatedly promised. It did substantially lower effective corporate tax rates and generate about $1 trillion of stock buybacks and dividends for shareholders. A May 2019 Congressional Research Service report found that the Republican tax bill had little measurable effect on the overall U.S. economy in 2018. And according to a January 2020 Congressional Budget Office report, the U.S. government's budget deficit is projected to reach $1.02 trillion in 2020, as the federal government continues to spend much more than it collects in revenue. This year's deficit would be an increase from 2019, when the government deficit grew to $984 billion. The deficit in 2016, President Obama's last full year in office, was $585 billion. CBO now projects that the deficit will be at least $1 trillion each year in perpetuity unless Congress makes changes. It was clear when the tax law passed it was going to produce a large windfall for the wealthiest and big corporations and exacerbate the deficit. 2 years out, the deficit is projected to reach $1.2 trillion, and the decrease in corporate tax revenue is even larger than was expected when the law was passed. With apologies to Jerry Reed, it sounds to me like corporations got the gold mine and the taxpayers got the shaft. I'd like to start with a question for you, Professor Kaiser. How were corporations able to use strategic tax planning following the Republican tax law to lower their taxes more than expected?
When the tax rate is lowered, there's an incentive to accelerate deductions to the year in which the tax rate is higher and defer income to the year in which it is lower. So the incentive is to accelerate deductions to 2017 and defer income to 2018 in the case of the corporate rate change. And the JCT report that was just released yesterday shows that there's data indicating that that certain deductions were in fact shifted. Deductions for contributions to employee benefits programs, bad debt expense deductions, deductions for wages and salaries generally. And the JCT report also notes that there is some evidence of deferral of income to 2018.
And are there things that Congress could do differently to make it harder for corporations to game changes in the law?
Yes, you could have certain phase-ins that I think would address some of these problems.
Professor Furman, the one-time tax on deferred foreign earnings was one of the largest pay-fors in that Republican tax bill. And what can we expect to happen to corporate tax revenues once we're done collecting the one-time tax on deferred foreign earnings?
Yeah, that one-time tax will go away, and so the cost of the other provisions will rise. There's different things moving in different directions, but this is why corporate tax revenue stays very low relative to the economy, which is how most economists, I think all economists, would measure it.
There were a number of things that phase out in the bill, but the big cost items stay forever, and this being one of the phase-outs. So what can we expect to see once that phases out in regard to the deficit?
Right. We would get less revenue, and if Congress extends some of the provisions in the Act or cancels some of the offsets, you would get even less revenue than what you see on paper right now.
And deficits would
And deficits
grow
would go up. Deficits would go up,
grow.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.